I just want to officially welcome you. This is the Roundtable discussion and virtual book launch of Building Stronger States, a guide to economic strategy and development. And it's an absolute honor to be serving as host and moderator for this virtual event. I'm Natalie Fort, broadcast journalist and program director for democracy with the 16th Council, which is founded by none other but the author of this book, Dr. Brian Reuben. Now, I just want us to kickstart with a very brief section. That's a quote that stood out to me from the book, and then we'll get right ahead into the program. So the book starts off in the first chapter of the book says, building stronger states requires visionary leadership, collaborative governance, and a relentless focus on enhancing productivity and innovation. Now, for over a decade, Dr. Brian Reuben has been dedicated to advocating for good governance in Nigeria and across the world, and his work, organizations, and initiatives continue to make a very strong impact in achieving good governance in Nigeria and globally. So without much ado, I'd want us to get started by introducing Alison Chirawa. That's Dr. Alison Chirawa, Director of Strategic Initiatives with the 16th Council. Also serves and is going to be delivering the opening remarks about our author, Dr. Brian Reuben, and introducing us to his background, his achievements, and contributions to global thought and policy. And I should add that Dr. Alison is also a very good friend of Dr. Brian Reuben, so there's no better person to get us started than her. Alison, over to you.
Well, we nearly had a mishap with technology. Thank you so much, Natalie. And what a beautiful start to a fantastic event. And thank you so much. It's absolutely my pleasure. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, and our valued guests. I'm sure, like Natalie did say, it's good morning for some, good afternoon for some, and good evening, wherever you are in the world and joining us today. It is my absolute honor to welcome you all to this incredibly, I think, a huge milestone and an occasion on the launch of Dr. Brian's book, which is of course newest. I say newest with deliberation and intention, newest literary achievement, because he's written many, many books before. And this one is Building Strong States. Today, we're not just only gathering to celebrate his launch of a book, but to actually pay a massive tribute to who I believe, I know I'm a little bit biased because he's my very own friend, who I think an extraordinary vision and contribution to one of Africa's most influential voices. And of course, he's a mentor to those who have been lucky to work with him and fellowship with him, like most of us here. And this person is none other than the remarkable Dr. Brian Reuben himself. He's a renowned author of international acclaim, visionary policymaker. He's a consultant, a thought leader. He's the founder, of course, of the 16th Council and a visionary and leading force behind the unstoppable Africa Economic Summit Group. He has selflessly, as Dr. Natalie, that's coming, as Natalie did say, devoted his entire career, maybe his whole life perhaps, to shaping bold strategies that empower nations. And he's inspired many leaders and uplifted many nations within the continent. His work has consistently reflected what I want to think is a huge commitment to Africa's economic resilience. He's driven sustainable growth and building a brighter future for the Africa that he so envisions and beyond. Dr. Reuben's passion for Africa is simply grounded, I want to think, in his unshaken belief in the continent's vast and somewhat underestimated potential. His tireless dedication has consistently changed the status quo, inspiring governments, institutions to reimagine the approach to economic development. His vision for Africa is not one of fleeting success, but of absolute endurance and progress, building on a very strong foundation of collaboration, as we will see later on with some of the contents of the book, innovation, and inclusivity amounting to Ubuntu, which I'm absolutely obsessed about for those that know me. So, to all the dignitaries, the thought leaders here today, and supporters, of course, present here today, thank you for kindly joining us. Your presence, of course, does absolutely affirm or reaffirms the shared commitment that we all hold to the ideals of Dr. Reuben. And these are ideals he so eloquently champions, because I think in this space it's very difficult to put your points across and be heard. And he does that with such beauty. And it's my hope that we all stand as reliable allies in the pursuit of stronger and more resilient states. Now, Dr. Reuben's latest work, Building Strong States, is an absolute testament, I beg your pardon, to his dedication to his expertise. And the book offers a really comprehensive roadmap of economic development, particularly at the state level. And it does address the unique challenges faced by regions like Nigeria in particular, while drawing lessons from global success stories. With its insightful approach, I guess, the book really provides actionable strategies for governors, policymakers, leaders alike, placing an absolute emphasis on the importance of creating locally grounded economic plans that actually mirror with the region's strength and resources. And I think we'll hear more on that later on. And through its pages, Building Strong States touches on the essential components of thriving business environments, from competitive dynamics and cluster developments to infrastructure and sophisticated demand conditions. This is not just a guide, ladies and gentlemen, for economic growth. It's resilience reimagined with an absolutely viable, sustainable approach, or perhaps a model for generations to come, well beyond Dr. Reuben himself. And as we celebrate this remarkable achievement, I want you to just quickly reflect on the timeless words of Dr. Reuben himself. It would be silly for me to come here, welcome you all, and not touch on this. So please allow me to indulge myself and honor my friend. In one of his sayings, he says that a state's potential lies not merely in its resources, but in the power of clear and cohesive vision to unlock opportunities. He also goes on to say, competitiveness is not a race to the bottom, but a journey to unlock the highest potential within our states, within our nations. And I'll quickly give you one last one. He also goes to say, building stronger states requires a visionary leadership, collaborative governance, and an absolute relentless focus on enhancing productivity and innovation. So therefore, building strong nations is not the task of a chosen few. It is the collective responsibility of us all. And united by purpose and driven by a vision of a future that will make us all incredibly proud for generations and generations to come. I want to thank you for being part of this extraordinary launch at the very beginning. And we'll now look into the profound insights and inspiration offered by this amazing book and viewed through the absolutely brilliant lenses of the very humble, the very learned, my very dear friend, Dr. Brian Reuben, who I'm absolutely proud of. And I think my smile says it all. But ladies and gentlemen, just before I hand over the mic to Natalie, this is a book that is, I know that Dr. Reuben has spent a huge amount of time. He's put in a lot of thoughts. I just wanted to give you a little appetizer as to what you're going to hear for the rest of the day. Please, as we hear, let us empower our institutions, let us empower our nations. And I know we are joined here by excellencies, governors, institution directors. Please dig deeper. The book is not actually very expensive. We will offer, I think someone will put in a link to the book itself on Amazon. It's available. I would absolutely, and this is not from the 16th Council, this is on my personal call. This is my personal call to action. Please, let's look at buying as many books as possible, donating them to institutions so that we do better for the future. And in the meantime, I'm also going to say, if you buy more than 10 books, I haven't been cleared by Dr. Reuben, but I'm going to say this. If you order or pre-order more than 10 books, Dr. Reuben, my dear friend, this is biased. Will you be able to sign at least one book for whoever buys 10 plus more? Just before we continue. A pledge?
Absolutely, Dr. Allison. Thank you.
First win for the afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Reuben. And I hand over to you, Natalie. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allison. So elegantly and well worded, really. Thank you so much for sharing. And the pledge that you got, Dr. Reuben, to commit to is very important as well. So thank you, Dr. Reuben, for committing to that. And yes, Dr. Allison, as you rightly said, before we round up with this event, at the tail end, we will have a very brief commitment of sorts, because yes, the book is available for sale, as Dr. Allison mentioned, on Amazon. Hard copy is available as well. And to ensure that we support this much needed initiative, we all are also going to commit to it initially, sort of think about it as a very brief virtual fundraiser of sort for the book, or auction of the book. Thank you, Dr. Allison, for your words there. And as we carry on, Dr. Allison, you did mention that within this space, it can be difficult to speak and to get your voice heard. But Dr. Reuben does that ever so well, and his voice has been heard and is seen as really a thought leader within the space, both in public and private sector. And there is one man who has committed himself to supporting the initiatives of Dr. Brian Reuben, and that's in the person of none other but Dr. Mazi Sam Bunwa. He serves as president of the Africa Economic Summit 2024, past chairman as well of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. He's served in top leadership with Pfizer as well, and of course has a long background in governance. Dr. Sam, thank you so much for joining us. And I should mention that Dr. Sam did pen the introduction for the book, and he's going to get us started now. Please, over to you as you share key highlights of the book and your thoughts on it.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, all the very distinguished people on this call this afternoon. I want to thank God that He has granted us all the privilege to be alive on a Sunday afternoon. And I trust that some of you went to church like I did. For me, it's always a pleasure to participate in the kind of things that I find Brian involved in. He has been quite prodigious in his desire to see Nigeria and the world to be a better place, to be better governed. And that is therefore not surprising that he has written this book, which for me is a wake-up call. As we all know, Nigeria has remained a chronically underperforming nation, but often a disproportionate portion of the blame for the undesirable condition has been put on the federal government, whereas Nigeria is around a federal structure of three tiers of government: the federal government, the state government, and the local government. The national revenue of the country, consolidated revenue, is shared between these three tiers of government. The federal government gets about 52% of the share. The state governments get 27%, and the local governments get 21%. But each time we are talking about Nigerian economy and its underperformance, an unusual focus is put on the federal government. Sometimes it's deserved, most times it's not deserved. But I think that Brian, in this book, has tried to take our focus a little bit away from the federal government per se. And tells us that the 36 states plus one, Nigeria has almost 37 states now, especially in this government of Mr. Tinubu. He has elevated the FCT to almost a state in terms of all that a state ought to have. So practically we have 37 states. And the point Brian is making in his book is that these states ought to compete and then be competitive to attract investment into their different jurisdictions so that they can become a major opportunity for the citizens of those states which make up Nigeria to have a better quality of life. And the focus, is, of course, is in competitiveness. The states ought to compete with each other and with other regions of the world. And the principal criteria for competing is making yourself better in some respects. Many of the states in Nigeria have different factor endowments. They have many natural resources. Others have more than the others. Some have solid minerals. Some have liquid minerals. Some have gaseous minerals. Also, many of them have different levels of human capital, skills, and development. And in the 11 chapters of the book, Dr. Brand focuses essentially on the subject of competitiveness. What are the factors that would drive competitiveness? In looking at the fact that the central issue in competitiveness is productivity. And it is the productivity that will drive the competitiveness of the states. And what are the drivers of productivity? He makes us to understand that the quality of the business environment, the infrastructure, and accessibility of that infrastructure, the regulatory environment, access to finance and capital, skill, workforce and education, innovation and technology, etc., are key drivers of productivity. And the moment we focus on this, then they will shape the business environment, which will then lead to the attraction of investments as we talk about both local and foreign. Because everybody knows that it's investments that creates businesses, programs and projects. And programs and projects and businesses create jobs, and jobs create wealth, and wealth brings prosperity, eliminating or reducing poverty. So the business environment must be such that investors will look at the states. And I believe that there are too many things the states can do to make their places the preferred investment destination. For example, what are the issues of registering companies? For example, the kind of permits that those states issue. How did they get out of the road unnecessary and hidden costs? If you ask an average Nigerian businessman, he tells you there are multiple taxations, which in essence are just multiplicity of taxation, which again, I think the current government in Nigeria and the federal is trying to see what can be done to bring some reform to minimize the multiplicity of taxes. But even without the federal government, within the states can take the initiative to reform their tax systems, create major tax incentives, because all over the world, investors are looking for where the tax is not only predictable, but also promotive of business, because every business focuses on profitability and continuity and sustainability. Of course, to be able to do this, we must be sure that we are crafting strategies that can make the states this attractive, not only within the country, but also globally. These economic strategies will enable the states harness their unique assets, address their weaknesses, and navigate global economic landscape with the clear objective of making the state more attractive to businesses and investors while ensuring long-term growth and prosperity for their citizens. In this chapter, in the book, and as you read through, you see that the author brings his business school background and knowledge by bringing what we call case studies, using states in the United States, like Texas, Massachusetts, states in India, and other states in Singapore and the United States, and even Lagos, to show how states that have crafted economic strategies gave them competitive edge in certain areas. So states have to decide whether they want to do strategic planning or not. But whatever they do, they have two options. They either do the tactical, which is a short-term reactive and sectoral strategic bent, or the strategic long-term broad-based sustainable strategies. And again, the author uses case studies to show the different strategies that are available to different states and to different levels of government. And they have something to look up to, which is one good thing about the book. It's not just theoretical based, but it's also giving case studies and examples of states elsewhere in the world that have adopted these strategies and made themselves much more competitive, even attracting investments over and over what is available in most states. I mean, if you go to California in the United States, for example, California is almost a country. Its GDP is bigger than that of African countries put together. So it is because they've crafted their own strategy, which is granting them competitiveness in a lot of ways. That's why you have a lot of IT development. You have a lot of film and telecommunications, because the Silicon Valley and all that in the Californian Valley is bringing investment into the area. Again, it's important to show how comprehensive this book is, even though in terms of pagination, it's not such a large book, but it has all that you require and presented in a manner that will be easy to read and digest. Brian speaks about, the way to fashion the economic paradigm that we find today, in terms of how do we take economic development. In the past, economic planning and economic policy was seen as the forte, or sometimes exclusive reserve of the public sector or the government. And that worked when it did, when government had a control or the commanding heights of most national economy. But as we began to globalize the world and globalize the economy, it's now becoming increasingly difficult for any country to plan its economic development focusing only on the private sector. So we're looking at alignment of economic policy with development of industry clusters in a collaborative manner to boost competitiveness. So governments are now collaborating with the private sector, with non-governmental, with multilateral agencies to ensure that they develop economic policies that are locally competitive and sustainable and internationally reproducible. So this is the book that we have in our hands today, a book that wakes up our nation, Nigeria, which is Brian's original country of origin. And it's a seminal work that is not cloaked in too much academic jargons, but written in fairly simple, straightforward way to allow easy comprehension by all. It is indeed true that many states in Nigeria today are unviable, given the way they currently operate, running to Abuja every month to collect booty, which in many cases, even if they were judicially utilized, will not make any dent on the poverty status of their citizens. Yet, many of the states in Nigeria are literally sitting on gold, especially the states in the north, which often surprise me when they refuse to readily embrace any changes or restructuring that should allow them freedom to the gold on their ground, to the diamond that they have, and even to the very, very rare minerals that are driving global technology. So this book, I think, gives a great push to these giants with their feet in the clay. And I'm hoping they will find time to read them, because the book will ignite their bones, put fire in their bones, and help them to use what they have to get what they want. My hope is that they will find this book appealing, and that all those who find opportunity to read this book, who are Nigerians particularly, will try and translate and make the book and its major imports available to the managers of the state of Nigeria, so that we can begin to decentralize economic management in Nigeria and hold the governors and subnational leadership accountable for the long years of economic woes in the country. But this should help them overcome those difficulties and make them stand out. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the book which you have today, which I think is a major contribution: Building Stronger States, a guide to economic strategy and development with focus on Nigeria. And I also say it is adaptable to other countries that have states or subnationalities. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mazi Sam Ohuo, for very profound insights, in fact, that you shared there. And I love the fact that you rounded up by saying that it's adaptable, because even in cases in other federal states or in some non-federal states, there are still some key aspects of this book and solutions proffered by the book that even in, for instance, Ghana, from a local governance level, can be utilized, I believe, by our leaders. So thank you so very much for sharing those key highlights with us. And now it is time for us to hear from the author of the book. There has already been so much said on him and his profile, but I'll just have a very, very brief introduction prior to his submission. Now, Dr. Brian Reuben has impacted leaders in government in large organizations from over 20 countries. This obviously includes the USA, the UK, South Africa, Ghana, India, Nigeria, of course, Israel, Egypt, and the list goes on and on. He works with governments, with corporations, nonprofits, and helps to position them for productivity and superior performance of these organizations and states. He previously served and is trained as an accountant, as was briefly highlighted by Dr. Mazi Sam. So this is a very much needed and key book coming from someone with an accounting background in terms of improving the GDP of the states in Nigeria. So without much ado, I'd like to call on Dr. Brian Reuben to run us through the why, really, why you thought it was so necessary at this point in time to release this book, and what your hopes and expectations are for readers and, of course, for actors and players within the political space in Nigeria and even Africa. Dr. Brian, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Nethley. Thank you, Dr. Allison. Thank you, Mazi, for that extraordinary introduction. And to everybody else who is here, it is my honor to welcome all of you distinguished guests, friends, and esteemed colleagues. It's an absolute honor to welcome you all here today at the launch of Building Strong States, a guide to state-level economic strategy and development. This book isn't just something born out of research and writing, but rather it is a product of passion, a deep belief in the untapped potential within our states, and an unwavering commitment to the pursuit of good governance in Nigeria. I believe that the right response to the challenges we face in the world is to come in from some area and actually provide solutions. So for decades, I have watched the remarkable potential embedded within Nigeria, potentials in our people, potentials in our industry, potentials in our union, in our regions and their unique strengths. Yet much of this potential lies dormant, underutilized, or mismanaged. As a result, many of our states continue to struggle with low productivity, unemployment, and a lack of competitiveness. This has consistently reinforced the narrative of dependence and the states relying heavily on monthly allocation from the center instead of becoming self-reliant economic hubs. This realization was the seed that inspired this book. I asked myself, what can be done to change this narrative? How can we unlock the latent opportunities that lie beneath the surface in each state in Nigeria? These questions led me to reflect deeply on my experience over the years working with governments and engaging with policy experts, drawing insight from global examples and subnational growth and transformation. The answer, I believe, lies in rethinking governance at the state level. I believe that if something isn't working, then it is imperative that the approach is adjusted. And that is what is at the heart of this book. Nigeria is a federation, yet we have often failed to embrace the true spirit of federalism, one that empowers states to chart their unique economic paths based on their strengths and competitive advantages. This book provides a practical roadmap to change that. It explores how Nigerian states can become more productive, more innovative, and more competitive, not only within the nation, but on a global scale. And as has been highlighted, this is not just about Nigeria. This is something that can work for any country, anywhere. It emphasizes the critical role of collaboration, specialization, and a focus on outcomes that directly impact the lives of the citizens. Take, for instance, the concept of clusters development, which I highlighted in the book, a model where states focus on their areas of strength and work together to build regional economic ecosystems. So states are not necessarily just doing something, taking an approach because another state has taken their approach. See, so imagine a scenario where agricultural states in the north can leverage their comparative strength to dominate the agribusiness supply chain, or oil producing state in the south can harness their resource not just for extraction, but for industrialization and innovation. These are not pure ideas, they are all achievable strategies that many states around the world have successfully implemented from Texas in the US to states in India. At the heart of this book is a firm belief that governance, when done well, can be transformative. It is not just about policies on paper, it is about creating real opportunities for businesses to thrive, for young people to find meaningful work, and for communities to feel the tangible benefits of progress. Good governance delivers measurable outcomes. And my hope is that this book will inspire leaders, policymakers, and citizens alike to embrace that vision. I want to conclude by thanking everyone who's contributed to this work and those who have joined me on this journey. This book is not the end. It is the beginning of a broader conversation about how we can build stronger states and ultimately a stronger Nigeria. I want us to remember this. The power of transforming Nigeria does not rest solely at the state. It resides in our states, in our people, and in our collective will to harness the opportunities before us. Together, we can make it happen, one state at a time. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Dr. Brian for those keywords that you shared. And one thing that stands out to me from what you said is that when things aren't working a certain kind of way, of course, in this context, in governance, you have to rethink it and have the right strategy. And that's what I believe this book offers, is that strategy for leaders in the governance space to be able to ensure that states are productive and with increased GDP for the betterment of Nigeria as a whole. Now, the book has 11 core chapters, well, 12, and then, of course, concluded with your final thoughts. And before we carry on, I'm going to briefly call on you, Dr. Brian. But before that, I just want to highlight some of these chapters within the book. I believe all of us here have most possibly read the book or have the soft or hard copy. And it starts with a quest for competitiveness in Nigeria, highlighting what exactly competitiveness is, what drives productivity at the state level, the quality of the business environment, building the foundation for sustainable growth. It also then touches on improving productivity within the business environment, strong clusters driving regional performance, geographical influence on competitiveness, creating a state economic strategy. Very important. How should states compete with each other? Because I believe, Dr. Brian, as you shared, and as Dr. Mazi Sam highlighted as well, we need that competition between states to ensure that they're each seeking to reach their maximum in terms of productivity. And as a whole, that's going to improve the country, and in this context, Nigeria. The chapter 11 is on the shifting process of economic development, and it concludes with aligning economic policy and clusters, and then, of course, the author's final thoughts. Now, Dr. Brian, I'd want you to kindly just spare us a few minutes where you highlight, from your view, what you think sort of captures all that the book seeks to establish, which chapter or which paragraph you could share with us and read out briefly to get us better acquainted with it, and the key sections that you feel highlight what you're looking at the book addressing. So Dr. Brian, if you can kindly unmute yourself and speak very briefly on that, on a key section within the book that you would like to share that highlight these strategic approaches that are suggested in the text. Okay, Dr. Brian might have stepped. Okay, Dr. Brian, you're unmuted now. So if you heard me, if you can kindly share a key section of the book that you'd wanted us to sort of delve into briefly.
Thank you. Absolutely. I'm happy to read from chapter 10, which The title of that chapter is How Should States Compete with Each Other? Because sometimes it's not very clear. Now, there's a quote by Teddy Roosevelt where he said, the strongest states compete by building on strengths, not undermining others. Now, in today's globalized economy, states face intense competition to attract investment, talent, and resources, whether large or small, wealthy or developed. Every state competes for resources that can support economic growth, job creation, and innovation. However, when states choose to compete, whether investment can have a profound impact on their economic performance. Approaches that states take to competition, tactical and strategic. Now let's look at the tactical approach. The tactical approach is often reactive and short-term in nature. It typically involves states, governments competing for new investments by offering incentives and subsidies aimed at lowering the cost of doing business. This approach may produce immediate results, but may not provide lasting benefits. It focuses heavily on attracting individual companies and large projects with the belief that increased investment will naturally lead to economic development. So, focusing on attracting new investments. A key component of the tactical approach is attracting new investments, especially from large corporations. States may compete by offering incentives like tax breaks, subsidies, and direct financial support to companies willing to set up operations in their region. Now, while this can be effective in the short run, the success of such investment depends on a long-term sustainability of the business environment. And there are cases to this which I'm going to skip, and I hope that if you're here and haven't got the book yet, you want to get the book so you can see some of those cases. And I'm going to briefly highlight the other approach, really, because in tactical approach, you say that the ideas include focusing on attracting new investments, competing for every plant, and offering generalized tax breaks. And there are lots of case studies on this approach. But let me move quickly to the strategic approach, which is an approach that I advocate. Now, in contrast to the tactical approach, a strategic approach to state competitiveness is focused on long-term sustainable development rather than competing for individual investments. The strategic approach focuses on creating an environment that supports local business growth, reinforces existing strengths, and fosters the development of key sectors that can drive the state's economy over the long term. A key element of the strategic approach is supporting local businesses, not just attracting new companies. States should focus on creating a business environment that fosters the growth of existing companies, particularly those that are part of established or emerging sectors. This support may include access to capital, workforce training programs, and tax incentives that encourage reinvestment in innovation and growth. Now, there are, of course, cases as well to support this. The key ideas with the strategic approach includes reinforcing areas of specialization and emerging cluster strengths. Now, I'm going to read this one just a little bit and then highlight the other areas. In a strategic approach, states should focus on reinforcing their areas of specialization, particularly in sectors or industries that have demonstrated growth potential. This includes supporting development of specialized clusters, which can offer unique opportunities for growth, innovation, and job creation. And this is what they did in Massachusetts with the biotech and life science cluster. So Massachusetts has strategically focused on building its biotech and life science sector, particularly around the Boston area. The state's emphasis on research and development, the presence of world-class universities, and government support has made Massachusetts a leader in the biotechnology and pharmaceuticals industries. The state's life science sector has generated significant investments, jobs, and patents contributing to the state's strong economic performance. So this is just an example of following the strategic approach rather than the tactical approach. And you look at another case like South Korea, education and investment infrastructure. That's another example. So states can either choose to follow the tactical approach, which can provide very quick returns, but it is much better for states to focus on the strategic approach. So in the face of intense competition and rapidly evolving global markets, states must make critical decisions about how they will position themselves for long-term success. While the tactical approach focuses on attracting investment through immediate incentives, such as tax breaks, subsidies, and infrastructure deals, may yield short-term economic benefits, it is a strategic approach that ultimately holds the key to sustainable growth and prosperity. A strategic approach is not only more resilient, but also more future-proof. Unlike the tactical approach, which often relies on a race to the bottom in offering the most attractive short-term incentives, the strategic approach focuses on building an ecosystem that fosters long-term growth. This means cultivating sectors with potentials, building specialized clusters, strengthening existing industries, and ensuring that the right institutional and human resources are in place to support innovation and economic diversification. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brian, for sharing that with us, that paragraph, key sections of the paragraph from the book. That was paragraph 10, I believe you highlighted. Thank you very much for sharing. Now, I'm going to just put two questions forward, after which I would open the floor for there to be any question or suggestion or just a comment, I should say, with regards to the book, preferably a question, though. And Dr. Brian, now, there are two key questions that I would want to pose, and then we can then open the floor. Now, first of all, as was highlighted by Dr. Mazi Sam, this book is relevant for not just federal governance systems such as Nigeria, but others, right? So, for instance, I would be biased because I'm from Ghana. And in Ghana, for instance, we do not practice a federal system. But of course, we find that from my observation as well as a journalist, appreciation of governance from a local level is a lot lower. A lot of things are put forward to central government, to government, as opposed to local government. How do you find, and how would you think that this book could solve the problems and could put forward strategies for countries that are not operating in the federal governance system? That's my first question. And then I'd have my second put forward, Dr. Brian.
Thank you very much. Now, why there is no governor and there is no such structure as a state, the fact remains that the various regions in Ghana have a leadership. Such a leader may not be called a governor, could go by any name, and there are different regions like this that make up the Republic of Ghana. So the same ideas actually apply, because the key is to understand the resources available, understand the positioning of the region and the surrounding regions, and now think of how to position such a region to leverage the opportunities, and by opportunities that include resources, natural resources, that includes the skilled labor available within that region, to create opportunities without necessarily depending on a location that is coming from anywhere. It's about building strengths within the region. It's about harnessing the resources and opportunities within the region. So whether or not there is a state, so long as there are regions and there is a government in that region, the same principles actually just apply.
Very well, briefly but well explained. Now, secondly, and this is highlighted in the book, but I just want you to touch on it briefly before we have any questions coming through. Of course, as is known, Nigeria is indeed a major player in Africa. It's got a population of over 200 million people. It's one of the most populous country, in fact, in Africa, seventh populous country in the world. Already got quite a vast economy, a GDP of over $240 billion. But yes, there still is a lot that Nigeria hasn't tapped into, right? Of course, which you've touched on. Now, my next question, Dr. Brian, would be specifically, first of all, how can we find that big business and industry in Nigeria could fit into this strategy of improving governance from a local level and from a state level? What sort of involvement we want to see from industry? Because, well, as per my observation, there are some stronger businesses and key industry players in the private sector in Nigeria. So what sort of role can they play in this? And specifically, what industries can be developed from a state level in Nigeria? Dr. Mazi Sam highlighted within the northern parts, there tends not to be a lot of cooperation in terms of the development. How do you find that could be improved upon? And in the northern sector of Nigeria as well, which sectors can be invested in to ensure higher GDP from a state level? Thank you.
Okay, I guess the question is how the private sector can work with the government to advance competitiveness. Was that the question?
It is, yes.
Okay, fantastic. That's very important. You talked about northern Nigeria. So in northern Nigeria, you have agriculture as a mainstay and a main focus, really. So let me give you an example with Lagos and Ogun State. Now, Lagos State in Nigeria is it can be considered Nigeria's business capital, really. And there is a lot of cluster, a lot of businesses, companies are present there, right? Now, there is this Ogun State that is very close to Lagos State. Okay, so rather than Ogun State trying to reinvent the wheel and compete with Lagos on the same dimension, which is the very mistake very many, several states make in looking for economic development. It is competing on the same dimensions, where if my state decides to invest in the airline industry, then the neighboring states want to do the very same thing. Many times that just doesn't, you find out that both states are actually struggling, right? So, but what Ogun State did was to leverage Lagos population and the large market. Rather than compete with Lagos directly, they established industrial parks and brought in several multinationals like Nestle and the rest of them into Ogun State to leverage the Lagos market, you see. So that way, they can take advantage of their positioning, their proximity to Lagos to develop Ogun State. Now, how would the private sector, play a role in this? Oh, that's very simple. That's where, as an entrepreneur, as a private organization, you notice, you understand the available opportunities within a state, which may not have been developed. And that becomes an area where you want to collaborate with the state. Now, Nestle reaps opportunities and benefits by being in Ogun State. So in the same manner, that's the same way, if a state, for example, in Nigeria has agricultural lands and is very good in rice production, that becomes a place for me to go and site my rice mill instead of to set up a shoe factory, for example. So it is understanding the available opportunities within the state and partnering with states along those lines to create opportunities to produce, to employ people. And so that's how the private sector plays a role, in improving competitiveness of a state. Understand the resources and then build partnership with the state by investing in the areas where the state has advantages. Once that is done, then you can easily reach opportunities which couldn't have been elsewhere. So that's how the private sector can easily partner with the state to build economic opportunities. I hope that answers the question.
It certainly does, Dr. Bryan. It does answer my question. Ensuring that states are not competing all right, but not competing within the same sectors. I mean, states realizing their strength and investing in that strength and leveraging, I should say, on that strength. It does answer my question. Thank you very much for sharing. Now, it's now time where I would open the floor for any questions, any comments that would want to be put forward to Dr. Bryan, to Dr. Mazi Sam, but for the most part, of course, to Dr. Bryan as the author of this all-important book. So please do raise your hand so I can see if you would want to ask any question or put forward any submission. You could also drop it into the message section. Okay, would anyone want to come forward with a question or submission? Okay, Dr. Allison, please do unmute yourself and you can go ahead.
I suppose for me, this is more on a personal note for Dr. Reuben. I probably can get away with asking him something personal about when he was writing the book. And I know that, there was a lot of thought, there was a lot of research behind this immense work that is produced. I just really wanted to ask Dr. Reuben, what aspects of writing the book perhaps did you find challenging, whether it was choosing, your case studies? I mean, what part of the whole entire compilation of this book did you find quite challenging? Just for fun. Let's put the policy making aside.
I love that question, Dr. Allison. Dr. Bryan, please go ahead.
Yeah, and I think you did it right on the head. It's actually finding the case studies that was most challenging, especially what data can be like in Africa. So it was pretty difficult getting data, especially from Nigeria. So that was the most difficult aspect of writing. But I'm glad that we're able to get most of that and put that together to help enhance understanding. Thank you for that question. Very important.
Well, Dr. Allison, thank you for the question. Dr. Bryan is always wearing his policy hat and his professional hat. So it's I just absolutely love that question. I can imagine how tough it was to get the case studies. Now, do we have any other question or submission from anyone? Please do feel free and share if you've read some key sections within the book, or if you'd want some answers from Dr. Bryan. It could be within, be it in politics, governance, local governance. Please do go ahead and share if you have that. I see one of my colleagues, I should say, within the 16th Council, Mary Jane, is with us as well. Please do feel free to share any submission that you have. Mary Jane, I believe, has been working with Dr. Bryan for quite a long while. Her name is cited in the book as well, within the appreciation section. And so please do go ahead, Mary, if you have any comments that you would want to highlight. Annette Sorensen as well. I would also just want to touch on, now, it's tough, I would imagine. There's so many people who think of writing, and it's just a long process to get yourself to put down, pen it down, and commit to completing written material. And so it's important as Africans, Nigerians, as Africans, for us to support our own. And yes, as was highlighted earlier by Dr. Allison, the book is available on Amazon. Dr. Bryan, you can further highlight the various platforms where we can actually purchase the book, both soft copy and, of course, hardcover. And I will just mention before you do so that the book is for sale for $14. Yes, for £14 for paperback and for £20 for hardcover. And you can donate a minimum of this plus shipping of course, for a copy to be shipped to any now governor of your choice. Of course, with the network that Dr. Brian has, we are targeting those in governance, in terms of getting these books sold and serving as solutions and strategies to them for their work. And so I would also want to entreat us to purchase these books for people who are in governance and have it shared across with them as well. Now, for £1,000, you will hold a special masterclass, a virtual masterclass that will be held by Dr. Brian for these officers of various governors on how to actually implement strategies that are put forward in the book for their respective states. So this is for us to carry that message forward as well. Donations can also be made for the book via PayPal. That's at payments@brianreuben.com. So I think it should start from us here within this virtual meeting room where we commit to it. So I would want each and every one of us to commit to purchasing the book, to purchasing it for ourselves, for others, and getting others to purchase it as well. Dr. Brian, can you kindly share where the book can be purchased from, both virtually and in person? I believe in Nigeria, in the UK. Please share where we can actually receive these books. I have the soft copy, but I'm very much looking forward to the actual hardcover because I find it a lot better reading the printed material. So please share where we can purchase the book.
Yes, absolutely. The book can easily be purchased on Amazon. You can also reach out to us. Anybody who's interested can reach out to us, and we'll be able to send the book, to ship out the book to them. So those in Nigeria, we should be able to ship the books to you if you reach out to us. For those in the UK and elsewhere, then Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk is a place to go and purchase the book.
Okay, so that's where it can be purchased. I would hope it could also soon be purchased in Ghana, in terms of in-person hard copy. So Dr. Brian, I guess subsequently we could discuss making that possible, because I'm sure it would serve a lot of players in our public sector very well to read it. But thank you for sharing where we can get access to the book.
Well, it's been nice listening to seeing us go through this activity to formally, make this book available, because all the efforts taken to write a book, especially this kind of book, which is not necessarily a mass appeal book. It is fairly technical and has a target audience. After all that effort, then it's important that the book gets to who is targeted at. I mean, that's why I think the comment you've made about making it beyond Amazon and all that. We in Africa, we live in Nigeria, and if Nigeria is a target, then there must be somewhere we can get the book off shelf or through a particular distribution point, so it's important, Brian, we'll talk about that. Nigerians don't go to Amazon all the time, especially the people you're asking to read this book. They don't have time. You have to force it through their truths. Secondly, I think I hear you talk about masterclass, which is okay. It's important that probably find other ways of making it more palatable. This is peel, and it's not very sweet peel. So even though it should be, but when people who have issues appreciating contributions like this, sometimes they think you are teaching them. So it's important that we look for ways also to see that activities where these master classes or some events can be organized for these governors through the governors forum or whatever. to make the books available to them, find opportunity for them to, so that we can achieve the key objective. Because if the book is not read, especially by the target audience, then the investment may not be fully realized. So that's the point I want to make. But I believe that all this will be worked out. So again, Brian, congratulations. And I know your pen will not run dry. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Dr. Mazi Sam. Yes, we need to get copies of the book as well in hard copy in Nigeria, Ghana, and across Africa and globally. And that certainly will be done. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, as we soon round up, I just want us to have a few words from Mr. Bimbola Ashiru, who has just joined us, and we're going to have some comments from him. He, of course, is mentioned in the book as well, a very respected thought leader and an author, widely celebrated for his forward-thinking perspectives on economic policy and governance. Thank you so much, Mr. Ashiru, for making time to join us. You are highlighted in the book, praised as well, and your comments are included in the book. But for the purpose of this virtual discussion, please do share some key highlights and insights from the book, why you think it's also necessary for players in governance and politics in Nigeria and across Africa to have a copy of this book and read it.
Thank you very much. I actually I want to congratulate Dr. Brian for a job well done. His focus, his commitment, and his reliability on so many things. I mean, getting himself involved, because he believes that, look, things must change, governance must change. And I've written extensively in my foreword, and it covers everything. So I don't want to leak it, because I want people to buy that book and read the foreword. And Mazi just spoke very well about him. And I want to say that I don't want to take much of our time. If you read through my foreword, you know that I've covered everything. And I want to commend him for a job well done. And I wish everybody on this platform a prosperous day and evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ashiru. Yes, your forward is very detailed. So I guess this is just a call to action somewhat for each of us to ensure that we get a copy of the book, read it, and make use of it in our lives, whether we are playing at the stage of top level governance or at whatever stage. I believe there are some key sections of the book that will be relevant to us. So thank you so much, Mr. Ashiru, for sharing. Now, us to commit to having the book purchased. I have a soft copy of the book, but Dr. Brian Reuben, this is my commitment that I'm going to purchase the book as well, purchase a few additional copies for friends and players who I know it would be very relevant for them. So this is my commitment to doing so. Dr. Allison as well, I believe, committed earlier to actually purchasing the book, even though, of course, she's already had copies presented to her. And so I believe that each and every one of us are committing to having this book purchased, sharing it with our friends, family, and network to ensure that things improve in governance in Nigeria and Africa and across the world. Dr. Brian Reuben, we congratulate you for this all-important initiative, and we will do our very best to ensure that it's carried forward. Thank you so much for this book and for your commitments to leadership and governance within Africa with the book Building Stronger States, a guide to economic strategy and development.
Thank you, Dr. Reuben. To say I'm proud is an underestimate. I am absolutely, I think from the moment that you did say you've written this book, and I saw just a small symposium of it, I never stopped smiling because I know that this book is going to be a game changer in Africa. But before we obviously close off, I just want to thank each and every one of the people that spoke, but actually also thank the amazing Natalie Fort. You've been amazing. You held this together. You brought the elegance, you brought the sophistication that I think Dr. Brian really needed for an event like this. So thank you so much. And of course, insights that have been shared this evening or this afternoon or morning, wherever you are, the contributions really call for urgency and importance of the theme itself, building strong nations. I think it needs no explanation. And of course, a special acknowledgement to the amazing Mr. Sam, who also did assist our very dear Dr. Brian in putting this together. And this, again, I think is just more than just a book. It's a powerful call to action for governance, for the continent, and a real, I suppose, a guidebook to those who are truly, and I say truly, with capital letters, committed to sustainable development and building real resilience across the economic agenda for Africa. And as emphasized throughout the discussions, I think that wishing for change is not just enough. We must take action to achieve the future that we all envision. And I think that the amazing Natalie continued to say that we all must commit. How many books have you bought? Yourself, your family, your friends, because we're here because we share a commonality that we know that there's so much untapped potential in Africa. Dr. Reuben has begun the walk. Can we move this from walking to running? And I think that if we all can take a step forward, I think that is what we need. So therefore, I encourage all dignitaries that we're here today, but I am also speaking to those that did not make it today, Sunday. We know people are pressed for time, but we also wrote to embassies. We all have a duty, and the duty is to go beyond our call of duty as we know it. What can we do? Let's consider donating copies to institutions, to our schools, to our local authorities, to our sub-nations. We all have a duty. I'm sure if we dig deeper, if I buy a book, one for myself, I'm certainly going to buy 2 or 3 for 3 embassies. Let's start doing that. And if you buy more than just 10, I promise you, Dr. Reuben will personally recognize you somewhere, somehow. And it's these actionable strategies that will spark real change in our region. We need to see change, and change starts with each and every one of us. It will be, of course, short of me to want to take off without actually using a quote from one of the amazing and wise leaders who once said, "Vision without action is just a dream. Action without vision just passes the time. And vision with action can absolutely change the world." I added absolutely because I wanted to stress, but it can change the world. We need action amongst our visions. So with that, let's hold those bold actions that we want to do into fruition. Let's continue to empower leaders like Dr. Brian is already doing, our scholars, those children that are coming up, the leaders of tomorrow, our communities, those that we are serving and that we want to save. We have a responsibility to do better for them. And beyond that, I want to say congratulations once more, Dr. Brian Reuben, a friend, a mentor, a business partner in so many aspects. You inspire me, and I'm sure, and it's actually incredible to see that you just don't inspire just ourselves here, the panelists, you inspire nations, you've inspired governments. If I could give you a Nobel Prize myself, today I would have just done that. But I know that, you quote your mother's words. And I also want to bring light to your mother, who I know you loved dearly. And I think that I said to you yesterday as we were preparing for today, that I know she's watching from above and she's proud of the work that you continue to do for her own motherland, for the land that she bore you, and for the nation that you have continuously and tirelessly saved. Thank you for being the wisdom in a nation that needs it. Thank you for being just more than just a son of the soil to the continent that absolutely appreciates you. Myself and all here present wish you a really good journey with this. And I know that there'll be so many speaking opportunities, governments. So we are going to take this forward to going into different embassies. So any ambassadors, any dignitaries here present, we want to hear from you. Please invite Dr. Reuben to come in and speak with you. Please open a gateway for us to allow Dr. Reuben to be heard because the message that he has mustn't end here. It must continue. So thank you so much, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you so, so much, Dr. Allison. That could not have been said any better. Thank you so much. And you highlighted actionable steps. Really and truly, this is what it's all about. This is what Nigeria, Ghana, Africa needs. It's leaders like Dr. Brian, who not just walk the talk, not just talk the talk, but walk the talk, and inspire us all to do so as well.
But I'm delighted to be here. I mean, Brian's work is exceptional. There's no doubt about it, and I think there's a lot of opportunity that we can see in some of the strategic kind of parallels that he's drawn in the context of developing the kind of relationships that need to be developed, the networks that need to be in place for policy to be in place so that we can execute at the operational level. And I think that's my take. And my experience from, kind of taking strategy, making it policy and implementation is something that I'd love to participate, in Nigeria and in East Africa as a whole, if I may. And I think what's extremely important is to think about what Brian argues fundamentally, which is to rationalize our existence within the context of the economic space that we find and the global complexities that we have to deal with. Perhaps we have to do a complete rethink. We have to really identify with some of the challenges that we face within the context of the global environment, both economically, geopolitically, and of course from a socio-political perspective, because at the end of the day, we've got to get the youth to get out and work. And that's key. Something that hasn't happened much in Africa as a whole, in my experience in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, has been such that it's given me the chance to, bring some real life examples that we've kind of worked with to the fore. And you have to trust the youth, and the youth are the ones that are going to carry things forward. And whatever comes of our collaboration, I hope that we can make a difference in our own little way to make a bigger impact down the road and design those policies that can be effective and brought forward. So that's all I'll say for now.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. It's unfortunate that the timestamp that you had wasn't, the accurate one, but nonetheless, it's so good to have you. And it's clear that you were very much ready to join us. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those, Professor Shiro, Rajendra Shiro. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, we've also got Toyin Sani, who is with us as well.
Let me start by congratulating Dr. Brian Reuben on a great work. I think there is probably not a better time than this for this book that focuses on what states ought to do to become drivers of economic growth for the sub-Saharan African economy and obviously for the global economy. And I note that the book is relevant to all economies across the globe. I can only add that the challenges that we face in our economies will require not just the action on the part of the public sector, but it will require action by public sector players and also by the organized private sector and by every single person. And also the academy have a role to play. And when the chips are down, when works like this are put down, the challenge is how do we get it in the hands of the key policymakers and those who are going to drive implementation, not just in the states, but also in the private sector as well, and just to make sure that everybody is playing the role that they ought to play. So that collective mobilization is critical, and I want to challenge everybody that is a part of this conversation to take this on board and to ensure that we engage. I run an investment banking group called Emerging Africa Capital. We in our work engage with quite a few state governments. So definitely I look forward to taking this conversation forward, speaking to the state governments on the need to continue to reduce the over-reliance that we have right now on exports of crude commodities and begin to look at how we can, engage across the entire value chain. obviously to revisit our neglected non-oil sectors and other sectors, to address our infrastructure gap, to ensure that we can fix our energy supply gap, which is significant across the continent, and also address the issue of low productivity and the volatility of our local currencies. Underpinning all this is our weak governance structure that needs to be strengthened. And one of the things that I find is that there has been a reluctance of the elite and those who are the stronger players have been reluctant to get in governance. So it seems we seem to have a problem across the continent in which we have essentially allowed ourselves to be governed, in many cases, by the least qualified. So how do we, bring those who actually have the leadership skills that we need and the technical skills that we need, how do we reconcile them with the fact that it's not enough to talk, but they will need to play an active role in, how we are governed across our states? Those are some of the conversations that I would like to take forward after, going through a work like this. Once again, congratulations, Dr. Brian, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I commend all the other speakers and wish us all an excellent new week, and a happy new year in advance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the early New Year wish as well. And thank you very much for sharing those key words. And what you mentioned is that we appear to let those who are sort of less experienced to have governed us. It's quite a salient point, not just in Nigeria and Ghana, and I think across Africa. So thank you so very much, Dr. Toyin Sani, for sharing, Vice Chair of the Emerging Africa Group. Thank you. Now, I do have to mention that we are going to organize a follow-up seminar, right? Because we need each and every one of you. There was an insufficient time today because of the complications with regards to noticing the time to join the panel discussion and so on. But we are going to organize a follow-up seminar, and either Dr. Allison, Dr. Brian, you can just speak on that further. Of course, key details will be shared subsequently as per platform and time, but it's necessary that we have a follow-up seminar with all speakers and with all players in the sector that we are also able to invite to join and to properly discuss the book and its strategies and solutions that are highlighted in the book. So Dr. Allison or Dr. Brian, please do share briefly some details about this follow-up seminar, and then we'll wrap it up soon.
If I may, while they're setting up, I absolutely, Natalie, it's vital that the debate continues. And as Toyin was saying very, very clearly, that sometimes inexperience leads to people appreciating people like us, who may be able to do something that they can value and feel that they're doing something. It's very complex in a political sense. So I'm delighted with the honesty, and I'm more than happy to contribute with Brian and all of you to see how we can take this forward, so that there is some a critical measure of appreciation, but also a critical measure of creating very simple things. I think very simply. I'm not your typical academic. I've come from industry. And so I have a real desire to ensure, to bring that East African experience, to the fore, having done some work in Ghana, within, if you like, the community space, getting people away from the bottle, to be really clear, especially the men folk. And you guys are in a majority here, so I can talk about it. That, the kinds of microfinance initiatives that we developed, the kind of critical healthcare things. This is not big stuff. This is not about building hospitals or building factories. It's about just empowering people to understand that their contribution is vital and it contributes to the GDP. And that, I think, is extremely critical. So they feel ownership being part of the country. And again, to Toyin's point, that when people in position of power have power without an appreciation for what they need to do for the community, we need to show them the way. I'll stop there. So, but I'm delighted at a follow-up session. I'd be more than happy to, and I'll make sure that we confirm again the timing's right.
Thank you so much, Professor Rajendra, for sharing. And it's brilliant to know that you are a professor who thinks simply as well, because that, yes, it's necessary, you know, and that's also highlighted in the book as well, in terms of just being material that all can absorb, right? It shouldn't be overly complex, that it's not understood by many. So thank you so very much for sharing. And before I have some words from Mr. Jabari, I just want to highlight, this was highlighted earlier, but where and how we can access the book. It's available for sale on Amazon. Of course, this is for the global readers, but to get it hard copy, which is personally my preferred way of, of reading such material, the book is also for sale for £14, £14, that is. Sorry, the book is for sale for £14. Thank you so much, Professor, for that. It's for sale for £14 for paperback and £20 for hardcover. And we are putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak. So we can donate a minimum of this plus shipping for a copy to be shipped to anyone within our network, specifically, as was highlighted by Dr. Sani, those in the governance space as well and players in the political field. So we're looking to share this material with them. So any governor of choice, this is in relation to Nigeria, for £100 will autograph, Dr. Brian will autograph 2 hard copies of the book, right? And for £1,000, we're going to be holding a special masterclass, a virtual masterclass for players within this field, for governors and officers within this field and public sector, on how to actually implement the ideas and strategies that are put forward in the book, so for the estate. And as with the follow-up seminar, this will also be shared. Details on this masterclass, this virtual masterclass, will be shared. And we would all want to donate. We've all vowed to donate to this. Donations can be made via PayPal, right? So please just take note of that. Payments@brianreuben.com. We'd want to donate. It's not an easy task to put such material together, such much needed material in Nigeria and in Africa and even globally. So this is key information on how we can actually purchase the book. And each of us here, I'm very glad, are actually committing to ensuring that we purchase it, purchase for friends, family, and others in our network. Now, Eric Jabari, I would want to take some words from you now. Please, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for this opportunity, and thank you for everyone for being on board. I mean, I read the book and I am really happy. This is an answer to many African countries. I mean, for Africa as a whole, given the challenges we are facing, to become self-sustainable ourselves. And specifically when I'm looking at the governance and policy inefficiency, right? So that really spoke to me profoundly because most of our leader comes together without convictions. We lack conviction to follow through. And early on, I was watching a video of Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, addressing African leaders. And this book really aligned with what he has said there, which is just miraculously or divine intervention, putting it together on how African leaders are not addressing their own problems ourselves, where we seek external assistance. And we have everything to make things happen on our own. We have the tools, human capital, especially well mentioned in the book. We do have it now, comparing to 20 or 30 years ago, where it was a lack or something we didn't have. We need to come together and actually approach professionals in Africa, including the ones in the diaspora, to exchange idea and come forth with solutions that are mentioned in this very much book, so that we can implement it with conviction and actually see the step moving forward, and not just preaching about it and hoping to see result. So that's really what I love the book about. I mean, it's really, I don't know, I'm so in love with the book, especially chapter 11, shifting the process of economic development. It has spoken really to my soul. And I'm really big on business and empowering youth and seeing the fact that, especially in South Africa, we do have, program where they do invest in the youth development. But even that faces challenges, a lot of challenges, because we're still going back into seeking assistance to the Western civilizations, which I don't have anything against them, but I think it's time for Africa to cultivate its own earth and build its own people. And this book, it really speaks about that. Thank you.
Thank you to Arik. Thank you so much for sharing, Arik Jabari. And it's great to know that this book has spoken to you, as I'm sure it has to many of us. And it will be speaking to many more players in the field as well. Arik serves as editorial director at the 16th Council, which is founded by Dr. Brian Reuben. Now, we've also got, having joined us, Professor Kofi Abochi from Ghana, the Dean of UPSA Law School in Ghana. Now, Professor Abochi has is very much admired and respected, really, within, be it the governance, business, and legal fields. And he was also to be serving on our panel. But Prof, I'm going to ask that you share some key words with us from the book in terms of how you find from where you sit that why it's so relevant, really, and how it can also be implemented in countries such as Ghana, which are not even practicing a federal governance system, and why you think it has the solutions for many of our governance players and the challenges that we face in governance. Professor Abochi.
Thank you very much. Forgive me, I cannot show my video. But thank you very much for the opportunity. First of all, there's an ambush. It's an ambush of a sort because I didn't know I was going to make a comment on the book, but it's an opportunity. And let me comment very greatly, Reuben, Dr. Reuben, for his initiative. I think if there's one thing Africa needs more than anything today, it is a book like this that will provide the kind of torchlight on our path towards governance reform, an initiative that continues to elude Africa. Even though we continue preaching about it, we are not walking the talk. And I think, therefore, that an initiative like this provides a very good context on how states should actually rise up from beyond the talk and to realize that governance is actually the bolts and nuts of people's daily lives. Sometimes there's a danger of speaking about governance in the abstract. And we may think that it's something for politicians, it's something for those at the helm of affairs. But the reality is that until the African state succeeds, the difficulties that Africa experienced in the 90s, such as civil wars and political instability and strife, starvation, and all the host of problems that African people continue to grapple with way back from the 80s until now. Until we build or bridge the governance deficits, we are not going to overcome these. And so I do hope that at the panel level conversation, I will have a much more detailed opportunity to share my perspectives on some of these. But the book invariably is extremely commendable. And I do hope that all of us will look for copies to buy so that we can be better educated. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Abochi, for sharing and clearly mentioning that we shouldn't sort of see governance in an abstract sense of the word, which I think at times, as was earlier highlighted as well by one of our speakers, Dr. Sani, leads to us having many who are not even as experienced in the field taking up the helm of affairs in Africa, because we find that governance may be looked at from a distant perspective and not in terms of its relevance in our everyday life. So thank you so much, Dr. Abochi, for sharing. Now, Dr. Abochi, I should highlight that, yes, we're all joining from various parts of the world, but there was some form of a mix-up with the time. So we've had some speakers having joined us earlier, and then like yourself having joined us now, because I'm sure the time that you might have seen was 4 p.m., I believe. So then that has led to, yes?
That's correct. That's correct.
Absolutely.
Actually, I'm in
Absolutely.
Kigali at the moment, and
You're in
so
Kigali.
I got the times a bit mixed up, but I know that 4 p.m. is supposed to be 6 p.m. here. So I'm just calculating things. So yes, I'm waiting for 4 p.m.
Right. Very well, no problem. So what was earlier highlighted is we're going to have a detailed follow-up seminar with speakers and to create the platform for more in-depth discussion. So yes, I know that you were ready to speak on the panel discussion level. However, I would just want to gather some thoughts from you very briefly on a few key sections within the book. You can still go ahead and use that opportunity, even though it's not panel discussion sought, to share your thoughts and key areas that stood out to you from the book, if that's okay with you. Now, so from where you sit, Dr. Bochi, Professor Bochi, I should say, within the legal field as well. And yes, I know that as you're in Kigali, you're from Ghana in Kigali, and you've worked globally. How do you find that countries that are practicing various sorts of governance, which may vary from federal system, can also find the solutions that are put forward in this book relevant and implement them in their respective countries? How do you find that can be done from where you sit?
Well, here's the thing. The challenges that countries face globally in reality are all the same. There are minute differences and there are differences in nuances in terms of how they apply to different countries. But the reality is, in terms of the broad parameters of challenges that confront countries, broadly, they are the same. But African countries particularly exhibit certain features that I'm sure Dr. Reuben's book may come in even more handy. If you look at African states, typically, they really haven't evolved from colonialism. It's a hard fact that we don't like to accept because colonialism sort of speaks of bondage and the fact that we are being ruled by others. But the truth of the matter is that the colonial state is very much centralized. Now, the further you move away from the capitals of the colonial state, the less and less present the state is. And so you'll find that if you are typically in an African country, the country essentially is all symbolized in its national capital. And once you move away, as you go into the rural areas of the country, a lot of the citizens do not even identify with the state in any shape or form, because basic state amenities and basic institutions of civic life disappear. And some things as simple as police stations may not be present in an area where you have a dense population. And the whole reflection is that you have a colonial arrangement, which is fundamentally centralized, because the colonial arrangement was centralized, designed to extract as much as you can from the country. And so colonial infrastructure, for example, railways, you will see that typically they all lead to the mineral extracting zones, be it the timber or be it the extractive resources such as gold and others. And the successor state has not really moved away from that. Unfortunately, we continue to experience that, and governance in terms of the deliverables of the concrete and basic benefits of civic life, we do not seem to deliver these to our citizens. And people fundamentally feel detached. They are not that connected to the state. It is part of the reason why we've experienced a gradual erosion of citizenship and an erosion of patriotism in these countries, because there is really no attachment, no sense of attachment to the country. Another difficulty, and this again may run through Dr. Reuben's book, another difficulty with African states is the issue of state capture. State capture, as you may know, is one fundamental feature that apparently characterizes virtually all African states, where you have elites who essentially may have taken control of the commanding heights of the country's economy, resources, and political power, so to speak. State capture is particularly dangerous because the capturers do not have any allegiance to the citizens. And the people who have their allegiance to the citizens have lost that allegiance by reason of the fact that their allegiance has been procured by those who have the resources, and those are the capturers. State capture has been a major problem in recent times, and the capturers have understood the game of democracy. So what they've done essentially is that you procure political and campaign financing. through political and campaign financing, you buy the elites of the state. You give them the money to campaign and to capture political power. And once they capture political power, they become beholden to you. State capture is also generally reflective of many African countries. And then corruption and the corrupted character of legitimacy. Again, this is a theme that runs through Dr. Reuben's book in different with different dynamics and manifestations. Corruption is a major problem. Now, we speak of corruption very often as if it's only limited to payments, and sort of people receiving monies for things they do. But when you look at corruption from the standpoint of rent seeking, which is the more dangerous version of corruption, if you ask me, you have a situation in which some people essentially tend to have the mindset that they own the country, they own the offices they operate in, all the way to the presidency. Presidents don't feel obliged to citizens' needs and citizens' demands and advocacy and things, because as far as they're concerned, they are in their offices as a matter of right. There is a sense of divine right of kings, which used to be characteristic back in the days of European monarchies, where monarchs were monarchs not because the people put them there, but because they were of finer blood and God said they should be the leaders. Our presidents, in some ways, actually manifest that divine right of kings mentality, where they think essentially that they are there because they're the best, they're the finer of the blood, and so by reason of being the best, they almost doing citizens a favor for being there. That explains why presidents and leaders don't feel obliged sometimes to account. The reason why accountability leads to victimization often and targeting of political opponents is because of the perception that I'm not supposed to account to anyone. You are lucky enough that I'm even your leader in the first place, So I'm wrapping up very quickly because you said the time has been messed up. I'm sure that people have different power to speak, but just quickly to chip in two things. The last but two, I think, are equally critical. And the first one is the issue of the external dependency of states. A lot of African countries are externally dependent, and that sort of eats into our governance deficits. Look, whichever angle you look at it from, even though the people who essentially, quote unquote, preach governance to Africa, especially tend to be these IFIs, international financial institutions, who use the bait of financing to, as it were, to get African countries to behave and to stay in the straight and narrow. The truth of the matter is that these entities also benefit from a corrupted governance deficit in Africa. And the reason and how they benefit is essentially that they like their darling boys to be in power. When the people who are the helm of leadership are the people who essentially are their yes men, these entities get their way. And make no mistake, the IMF is not a charitable institution. The IMF is a business model, a business entity, so to speak. They have to make money for their shareholders, and their shareholders are out there and they're known. The World Bank is not a charitable entity. So apart from the fact that they have to make money for the people they work for, they also operate within the context of something we call the business of development. And in the business of development, developing entities or developing organizations, so to speak, as they are called, development agencies or partners. Development agencies or partners, these agencies operate to develop the entities they operate to develop. Nonetheless, they also survive on the underdevelopment of these entities. In other words, the day these countries develop, the day Ghana is weaned fully of IMF support, what is the use of the IMF? Or the day developing countries are all weaned from IMF, what is the use of the IMF? And so there's a certain anomaly, there's a certain irony that these entities are here to support development, yet they feed and fester and survive on underdevelopment. And it's part of the reason why I think, as we reflect on governance and the governance deficit, these entities cannot be left out of the equation. I have to say that if it was in the book, then I probably, because I ran through it, I probably missed it. I didn't see that aspect of the conversation in Dr. Reuben's book, and perhaps in the second edition, this is something that he may want to look at, because and it's not just him, but virtually all the governance books that I see, I don't see an in-depth discussion of the role that these IFIs in particular tend to play in terms of the governance deficits within the municipal realm. Then the last one is an irony, and the reason it's an irony is what I call the electoral misfortune. Democracy was actually introduced apparently to bridge our development, and the reason is, the assumption is that if we're under dictatorship, we're not going to do well. And I think we all agree that, one-man rule didn't bring us much, across Africa. But election has equally been something of a pain. Elections have equally been something of a curse, particularly because of the way we've gone about it. many African countries have become electoral mills. All we do is just go through elections. We go through elections and we wait for the next 4 years. And in between the 4 years, there is close to zero governance. All we have is a few people benefiting. All we have is political exclusion. What we have is political suppression. Sometimes you have cases of, human rights abuses covered up, and governance is really a pretended model, so to speak. But the only time we come to life when it comes to governance is elections. Now, because of that, two things are produced. First of all, there's a perception that once we go through an election without incidents, in the sense of once we don't kill each other openly, then we're fine. Then we're a democratic country. Now, I have to say that my country, Ghana, is an example of such electoral and normal electoral misfortune. The other problem or the other manifestation of this electoral misfortune is that we tend to have campaign-driven development. So we don't have development for the sake of development. We don't have proper development, but we have campaign-driven development. So, for example, we build infrastructure to reflect our voting dynamics and to reflect the kinds of expectations that we have from for the voting public. We indulge in governance feedback by way of propaganda, essentially just to get people to believe our side of the story and not information the way it's supposed to be distributed in a civic way. So there's a danger of going on and on. I would just like to end at this stage, but essentially highlighting the fact that this book again provides a good context for the kinds of conversations around the themes that I've already mentioned and many more that he himself has spoken about. But it's important for us to also start thinking a bit beyond the conventional and the orthodox, because I think that some of the challenges or difficulties that we have in governance, they are partly due to the fact that we may not have gone outside the orthodox critiques. And it's part of the reason why we go through reforms. Nonetheless, we don't see the kinds of results that we need to see. And one area I haven't been able to mention because of time, I'm sure I'll leave it like that. But the area of culture, some people have spoken about culture, the impact of our culture and our tendencies, our ways of doing things. I spoke about rent seeking. But if you go deeply into African culture, some people tell you that rent seeking is fundamentally our culture. And so how do we divorce ourselves from our culture and be able to achieve the governance dividend? We can't speak with the different sides of our mouth on the same thing and be able to achieve an outcome. So I'll leave you at this stage, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Professor Abochi. In fact, I was taking notes as you were speaking, because there are so many key aspects that you highlight there. And yes, I did just see Dr. Sani put in the chat section your comment on campaign-driven development. I think being Ghanaian as well, of course, as we all do know, we just held our general elections not too long ago on December 7. And Professor Abochi, I'm sure you also observed the tendency to have a lot of projects, say, commissioned just within the month or even a few days up until the elections. So where you highlight a lot of these developmental projects being as a result or being fueled by campaign efforts is so factual. And elections as well, we find that when we have peaceful elections, as you said, we are all well and good, or we perceive ourselves to be a strong democracy. But what happens between those 4 years, right? Now, Prof. Abochi, I just want to briefly get your thoughts on this and how you feel that the book on building stronger states can address this current dynamic within Ghana, what we are likely to see in the 9th Parliament. So I'd want your thoughts on this briefly, and then we would have another contribution from Dr. Sani. Now, we know that we just held our elections, and as you know, the current opposition has a majority over 2/3 in parliaments in terms of the seats, and something that they're very glad about. But what are we, from a legal standpoint, and where you feel that the book also sort of touches on this aspect, how do you find that this is likely to have an impact on local governance? And is it going to help or hurt us, this 2/3 majority in parliament, and how measures of accountability could be less likely? If I could get your thoughts on that briefly, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Okay. So if past history is anything to go by, then we are not much hopeful. And the reason is because the experience has shown that Parliament has not been the kind of corporate constitutional entity that the framers of the law intended. Parliament was intended and structured to be the most powerful organ, with one good reason. It is a collegiate body, and as a collegiate body, it has a leverage to rein in the one-man body, which is the executive. The executive is a one-man body, it's the president, and the president has his agents, who are the ministers. They all report to him. Whatever they do, whatever he likes is what they do, essentially. But Parliament was supposed or designed to be a collegiate body to check the executive. But the history has consistently shown, rather sadly, since 1993 to date, that Parliament has been a follower and not a leader of the executive. Parliament was supposed to be a leader of the executive, to rein in the executive and to direct and lead the executive. And that's why everything, virtually everything, which springs from the executive is actually parliamentarily owned. So, for example, the budget is not the executive. The executive submits the budget to Parliament, and Parliament approves it. When Parliament approves the executive, the budget is not the executive anymore. It is Parliament. That's why the appropriation bills and all these things are passed. The taxation, for example, all these taxes we blame governments for. No tax in Ghana can be levied without Parliament approving. So if you have a strong Parliament, from ministers' appointment to the appointment of the Chief Justice and judges, to the appointment of all state parastatals, to the public financial management, all of them, virtually all of them, they have to go through Parliament. International commercial transaction. We complain about loans, we complain about borrowings, all these complaints we have. The sad part is that we don't seem to direct them at Parliament. The real blamer here is Parliament. The executive may be a proposer, but the one who approves is Parliament. So unfortunately, I'm not very hopeful if history is anything to go by. The only thing and the only way we can have a change in an about turn is if the president-elect, who will be president then, decides to inspire parliamentary independence and autonomy. So in reality, it's an issue of how the executive sort of manipulates or rather allows Parliament to function. So Parliament can decide to divorce itself from the executive, but in reality they don't. And the reason is because of incentives. You know, they want executive incentives. They all want to become ministers, and so they want to catch the eye of the president. So they are trying to behave well. I'm the one who approves the most. I'm the one who raises my hand up and approves everything you bring, that sort of thing. So they are all sort of racing to the bottom to sort of entice the executive and to get the executive to appoint them. So unless you have the executive saying, listen, my model of reward and my incentives have changed. I'm going to actually reward the parliamentarians who do government business properly, not just approving. Show me that you are doing leadership by way of legislative leadership. Show me that you are actually, you are competent, so to speak. Unless the executive induces and encourages this, you simply cannot have a case of parliamentary independence and autonomy, which we're wishing and yearning for. So I'm a pessimist by history, but I'm trying to be an optimist by hope in some ways.
Brilliant response. Thank you so much, Professor Abuchi, for sharing your insights on that. It's quite interesting to me as well, from where I sit as a journalist, just observing those dynamics and what we are likely to see in the 9th Parliament. So thank you so much for sharing. Now, I must acknowledge the presence of Dr. Babatunde, who's with us as well. Thank you so much, Obrima, Dr. Babatunde Obrima. Thank you so much for being here. Very soon, if you do have some comments that you would like to share, or probably questions or just comments, I would like for you to share them in a few minutes, but thank you so much for being a part of this. It's good to have you. Now, Dr. Toyin Sani, I'd want your take on this aspect, which was highlighted earlier by Dr. Brian, and of course is highlighted in the book. But from where you sit, how do you feel like private sector can better support these initiatives and solutions and strategies that are put forward in the book to ensure that we do in fact help build stronger states in Nigeria, and then from a continental perspective as well within Africa?
Thank you, Natalie. And my view is, the first thing is we in the private sector have to get away from this feeling that we're immune to the problems of the general populace. And let me explain what I mean by that. So over the years, we have found a way, the elites have found a way to essentially exclude ourselves from the grief of the common man. we live in our own private gated estates. We generate our own power. We, if necessary, generate our own water. We provide our own security. We essentially stick our heads in the ground and act like, economically we're above all of this and we can escape, the fate of the common man. Now we need to recognize that that is a lie that we're telling ourselves. If it gets bad enough, it will get to us in our gated estates. We are not safe. Once we understand that we're not safe, and by the way, we also have the segments of the private sector that is colluding, essentially, and conniving with bad governments, and essentially saying that we're getting our own courts, we're getting our own contracts, we're making our own deals, and really we have to keep quiet. Now, when everything goes sour, as it will inevitably if things continue that the way they are, we will all be victims. Now, so what should we do instead? We need to start putting our money where our mouth is. We need to raise funds that are dedicated to, through like political action groups, political action committees, raise funds that are dedicated to ensuring that the right candidate gets into government. These funds will then be backed up with screening of candidates and very strong and consistent advocacy. In terms of also how we run our companies and how we run our businesses and how we interface and do business with the public sector, we need to begin to set up our own codes and live by them and name and shame our members when they go outside of these codes. Bottom line is that charity begins at home. It starts with we ourselves, and the denial game must end. Of course, there should be a lot of conversations, advocacy, but it cannot be all talk. There must be action that we're putting behind our talk.
Thank you for sharing, Dr. Sani, there. And you say private sector is not immune. And I like how it's very descriptive, really, in terms of how you address it. You earlier said that we have to have such more players who may typically not involve themselves in governments and governance and involve themselves in that field. And the private sector as well should recognize that in no way are they immune, right, from what happens at the local or ground level within governance and politics. Thank you for sharing your insights there. Now, Dr. Brian, I would need you to kindly respond to these. Now, there were a few comments that were highlighted, as Dr. Sani has just touched on, and we earlier had Professor Abushi highlight as well. Yes, we need private sector to be more involved in governance in Nigeria and across the continent. But I found it interesting, the point that was highlighted earlier on the governance deficits that organizations like the IMF tend to sort of play on, right? And they feed on the underdevelopment of, be it Nigeria or many countries within Africa, Ghana. How does the book, from where you sit in public policy, how do you feel like this can be addressed? And specifically with this book on building stronger states, what solutions and strategies does it put forward in terms of dealing with that dependence on bodies and institutions like the IMF? Dr. Brian, you're still on mute. Now, I want to first of all confirm if you actually heard my question, but if you did, please do unmute yourself and respond to it because you're still on mute. Well, while at that, Dr. Brian, earlier I acknowledged the presence of Babatunde Obrima, Dr. Babatunde. So thank you so much for being with us. And as I did share earlier, I'd also had wanted you to share any comments that you had with regards to the issues addressed in the book and the strategies put forward in the book. So Dr. Brian, you're unmuted now, but Dr. Babatunde, if you could kindly do that briefly, and then we will take Dr. Brian's response. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that the biggest challenge we have in African leadership is the lack of strong institutions, which aligns with what Professor Abotsi had mentioned, where these institutions that should be the checks actually play along with government, judiciary, the security forces, the election commission. So I think that how do we ensure that we have institutions that are strong and are independent of government? Until we can achieve that, I think that according to Dr. Abotsi, we're still a long way ahead. But also the fact that do we have the right type of leadership structure? Why are we using the presidential or why are we using the parliamentary? I mean, they're not natural to us. So how do we define what really works for us? I think we need to get to that stage. What will work for us that will ensure that Africa progresses? I think those are two issues that needs to be addressed, and until we can really deal with those two issues, I guess that will just be, like you said, campaign development is what we're going to keep having, and what we have is money politics. The biggest bidder takes the vote, and which is quite sad. Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Babatunde for sharing your insights there and the need to strengthen our institutions, not just in Nigeria, but even in Ghana and across the continent. So thank you so much for sharing. Now, Dr. Brian, before you respond to the question regarding dependence on the IMF, I'd also want to acknowledge the presence of and have a few key words from Ms. Aneth Magunwa, the Chief Executive Auditor of the Department of Health, South Africa, previously served as the Director General for the Department of Justice in South Africa. So Ms. Aneth Magunwa, thank you so much for being with us, and please do share some key thoughts from the discussion so far and from the book, and then we'd carry on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have gone through the book, maybe just a little bit about myself. I've also worked in the National School of Government. So even as I'm listening, that gave me a bigger perspective of how the whole of government actually operates. So I read the book and I actually found it to be interesting. And yes, I'm hoping we can really build stronger states in Africa. And as I was going through it, I made a note of some of the things that were highlighted there. And I'm grateful for the book. So thank you for the work that you have put into it. And looking at Africa as a whole, it's quite interesting. And I'm going to share a story a little bit later about why I'm saying that. But I just make a note of a few things. So in South Africa, we have what we call the National Development Plan, the NDP 2030. I'm sure you may have heard about it or not, but some of the factors that are highlighted there as priorities and goals for our country are actually reflected in the book. I picked up 3 to be exact, but that's something that maybe we can discuss later if you'd like me to go through that, because I understand you're going to have a follow-up meeting, but just to summarize. Then I've also looked at something when I was in the National Department of Health. When we were supposed to come across COVID, before that, I had a plan, a risk management plan, where I was worried about Ebola. And it just so happened that I felt sitting there and addressing Ebola as South Africans, it's not going to work. And I was sitting and wondering, and here's the book, and I'm wondering, why didn't I get that book back then when I so dearly needed it? But in any case, as I try to find ways to address the issue of Ebola, I saw in chapter 10 of the book as well, you're looking at weaknesses and strength, which is a good thing because in today's models, we call it risk management. So previously we had a SWOT, which will then look at weaknesses and strength. But then I came up with a plan to say that this is how we're going to address Ebola, but we have to then have synergy with other African countries in order to see whether this plan is going to work. Looking at the port of entry was a key thing. It just so happened when COVID hit, the very same plan became a proactive plan that began to address certain things in our country together with our fellow African countries. You know that with the Department of Health, there are training of doctors that involves not just South Africa, but it looks at other doctors that are trained, together in Cuba and other places, even as government agrees on some of these initiatives. We have a cluster system that I'm listening and trying to hear how best it addresses some of the things that we're talking about. I can understand when we look at national government, we look at provincial government and the local government that touches into municipalities. But for me, to get to a level where these begin to work together, where we really leverage on having various state departments, because when you look at the South African government, even amidst the three that I've raised, you still have your government departments that cut across because of what we call demarcations. And those demarcations are attempted to be addressed by the availability of municipalities. Now, if we are saying we're going to look, for example, at agriculture, we know that that will better be addressed at local level. Whilst when you begin to look at issues such as how best we can create an income out of it, it's one thing to say, how does it become a social benefit to the people within our own country? And how does it then begin to generate an income? And for government, it's really a different ballgame altogether. Too many dynamics there, because the heart of the people, even when you're sitting in government meetings, say for instance, SCOPA, which is where Parliament then begins to meet with executive management. Some of the meetings where I sit in, ministerial meetings as well, then the people's hearts are saying, we want to have a social benefit, which is then empowering our people. But then how do we then best get funding in this case, where we can then take some of the resources that we have? So if we're using agriculture, for example, as an example, worked very hard to really derive from our own country. We have minerals as another example. I know maybe I'm going too much and I'm taking too much and fitting it into one ball, but we can then unpack it a little bit later. How do we then take that and generate an income that comes back into our country and becomes a benefit? And when you look at our currencies that vary, we can take advantage of some of those things. And with the clusters, if I were to go back there as well, you will then have your economic development as a department that is separate from the DTI. But the cluster then seeks to combine those together with agriculture, social development, and whatever. And most of the things that are raised in the book, should it be taken as a strategy that we can then look at to say, how best can we take this to the ground? And there's a part that bothers me, which is a part of implementation. I'm not going to go and repeat what I think you call him Professor Abosi. Sorry for the spelling if it's not correct. We may be pronouncing these things differently. He has raised certain things such as state capture and I'm just going to I made a note, corruption. So when you look at those, from where I'm sitting as an auditor, for me, it's risk management. If we have a very good risk management plan, we won't miss any of the things that we're talking about. And when we say governance, where I am sitting, we will then have as an auditor. So if I was going to go out and conduct an audit, I will take everything starting from the political decision making, the policies that we have in our country, and the role players, as well as some of the standards that have been so correctly put in our country to address some of those things. When you take the regulations and all those things placed together, if we had to measure, our measurement as auditors always goes into which department has provided enough for the funds that we have assigned or allocated to that department. Meaning, have we achieved all the strategic plans that we have highlighted in line with our Public Finance Management Act or Municipal Finance Management Act? So it's so well structured that if you look at the policies that we have, one will sit and wonder at the end of the year, why are we not getting it right? So for me, there is still a worry that should we want to reach that level, there has to be a country that has achieved. So when sitting, I'm saying a department will then achieve, another department will not. There will be a rating where we'll say it's a 4 or 3 or whatever way we put. And I'm outside risk management. I'm talking performance now. Should we get to that level from Africa where we're sitting, it would be very good to say, in terms of agriculture, we're drawing from Nigeria, if I were to use that as an example. And in terms of minerals and energy, let's draw from South Africa. If we close one eye on load shedding and other challenges that we're having, or in terms of another country, let's draw. And using those various strategies, how best can we then learn from one another and then implement in our own country? And I will just leave it here because, yeah, there are others that I would like to kind of share even as we go further and I listen to all the other speakers who were talking. But thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you too so much for sharing. I know so much to say and not a lot of time, but thank you so much, Ms. Anetha Magonwa, and your long experience really within the field as shows in all these suggestions and that you're putting forward. So thank you so much for sharing such key thoughts. Now, Dr. Brian, I'm going to come to you shortly, but I'd give you just a few minutes to ponder over the question concerning the IMF and our overdependence on the IMF, because I just want to have some comments as well from Professor Rajendra. Now, that's specifically with regards to from an educational standpoint, right? Where do you feel like there have been gaps within, be it Nigeria, where you are based as well, not just Nigeria, but where you are based, and across Africa? What loopholes and gaps do we have from an academic standpoint that you feel have slowed down the pace of building strong states, as it were, across the continent?
Natalie, I think that's a really interesting observation. Education, as we know, plays a very significant role in, and I'm not talking about education from a standpoint of a degree. I'm talking about education, at the grassroots. And I think Aneth mentioned something really interesting about farming. My experience with farming, and particularly the north central region of Nigeria, where I've been privileged to have traveled to, that so-called middle belt. It's endowed with amazingly fertile land. It's got favorable climatic conditions, albeit with the challenges of climate change, and of course, a very strong agriculture base. But I have not seen anybody talking to one another. See, as a farmer, my relationships is with a cooperative. That cooperative goes to bat for me. It talks to other cooperatives who bat for other partners. So in effect, we've got a network effect. And that is something that absolutely is critical, because it's, people talk about eco-friendly agriculture and what, but tell me one farmer who, thinks about eco-friendliness when they have a family to feed and they got to make some money selling, whether it's sugarcane or peanuts or groundnuts or whatever you want to call them. So to me, the goal should be to establish, kind of these, we talked about clusters earlier on, and that's a big word, but food security is extremely important. And for that, I believe academic institutions play a huge role. Just to give you an example of something that we developed, particularly from India, where I've just arrived here yesterday, that the relationship that the farmers had was very disparate, disjunct. Farmers usually will sell their produce without doing anything to it. So how about if you're growing oats, can you make rolled oats and put them on somebody's breakfast table to get a bit more money? So we took a bunch of farmers, groups of 12 at a time, and we did that over 3 years, many farmers that we brought along to the UK, to agriculture institutions, and to look at other small farmers who were making cheese, who were making wool, who were doing these kinds of things. So, I think very basic. I don't want to think huge, because once the ball starts rolling, things kind of fall in place. Now, to answer your bigger question in the role of academic institutions, it's about creativity. It's about understanding, the problem. I have never, ever looked at finding solutions. I've only looked at finding those questions that need to be thought through, because those questions lead to more questions. So, sadly, we think about finding answers and having solutions to problems. I don't think there are solutions to problems. There are more questions. And I think if people ask the right questions, the solution becomes quite, apparent, if I may, in that sense. And to me, like I said, I think simply, and that's how I think, and that's critical. To me, coming back to education, it's about revision of curricula, making them relevant. Let me give you a very simple example of a small technical school in the middle of Connecticut who have built half my house. And these are 17-year-old children who then go on to become amazing employees, amazing employers over time. And this happens in 10 years. It takes 10 years to make that happen. And in the life of a nation state, 10 years is not much. And this is my key kind of thinking, because we have to enhance employability. We have to empower youth. African youth are simply amazing. I've yet to meet an African person under 25 years old who sits there with his head in his hand and says, what do I do next? They've got this amazing go-get mentality. I'm not saying here because y'all are all African here and I want to make some bonus points. Very simply, that creativity needs to come out of the nutshell and actually propagate itself into something bigger. Because industry partnerships, we talked a little bit about that. That industry partnership at the educational level is critical. And some of us have that experience in building those. And that's why when I talked to Brian earlier on to participate, I said, let's take this further in a way that allows us to strengthen our relationships within the diaspora, but also taking forward an appreciation of what academic institutions can bring to the table to enable and to reduce the gap between work, employability, and education. These are three very distinct, entities that I believe are absolutely critical. And that's where institution building starts, because it starts with capacity building, something that we've been involved with. And whether it's NDP 2030, your priority goals that we talked about, or its synergy with other states, all of that comes under that educational umbrella, which we all must, kind of think about and think hard about. And we can create these amazing things. And now, with the power of Zoom, I mean, look at us, we're in several countries at the same time, maybe slight connection problems, but overall, we can talk to each other, we can make sense to each other, which is about sense making. And that I think is critical to us. So thanks again, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Professor Rajendra. Very simply put. Thank you very much for that. And yes, as you highlight, empowering the youth as well. We do know that Africa's youth population is quite significant. 60% of the continent's population is below the age of 25. And that's quite key. It's very important to highlight, and how this is even likely to play out in our governance and politics in some years to come is quite interesting as well, in terms of how the youth are appreciating issues such as these. Now, Dr. Brian, your response to my question concerning the IMF, and before you go ahead and respond to that, I would just highlight some key statistics with regards to that sort of reveals or goes to back our overdependence on the IMF, as was earlier highlighted by Professor Abuchi. We know now the IMF has provided financial assistance to Nigeria. It's provided financial assistance to Ghana. It's done so in Kenya as well, amongst many across the continent. And we continue to depend on the IMF. It's sort of a recurring cycle where in Ghana, for instance, we had the current administration vow not to return to the IMF, but it was done. I mean, we've returned to the IMF and we've been supported by the IMF with a $3 billion loan program. Nigeria as well has been supported by the IMF. So now, Dr. Brian Reuben, this book on building stronger states is critical, right? And certainly as Africans, we wouldn't want this cycle of returning to the IMF to be a continuous one, because as we depend on them, they benefit off it as well, as was highlighted by Professor Abuchi. What solutions does the book on building stronger states offer in terms of facilitating and navigating that space? And how do we get ourselves out of this dependence and overdependence on the IMF? as we are now rounding up soon, and we'll soon draw the curtains, I would also just want to invite anyone who has any comments or question to please do so and go ahead and ask if you have any comment or question as we prepare to round up. Arik, I don't know if you have any final words or that you would want to share, or Dr. Babatunde. If there are any, please do go ahead and respond to them as we hopefully have Dr. Brian reconnect and we have his response to that question. Okay, Dr. Brian, are you back on and are you hearing clearly? Okay. So well, I'm sure we'll get him clearly in just a few minutes, but it looks like he just hopped back onto the call.
Yeah.
Now, in the absence of any further questions or comments, I'm sure we would all agree, really, that the points that have been highlighted here are critical, and the book is a much needed one, not just across Nigeria, but in Ghana, across the continent. And I see on the chat as well, Dr. Allison mentioned there's so many insights, and this conversation, very important, mustn't end here. It certainly must not end here. The passion from within, the desire for change is indeed real. Absolutely, Dr. Allison. And this is why we are going to be organizing a subsequent discussion, right? A much more detailed discussion, because I know that many of our speakers, we didn't get the time to properly touch on the topics. But this is to say thank you yet again to each and every one of you for sharing your thoughts, your insights, and for committing to purchasing the book and sharing it within your network and ensuring that we get the word out there some more. Now, finally, Dr. Brian, we appear to have actually lost Dr. Brian. He's hopped off the call. I'm going to send him a quick text and hopefully he gets back on.
I think also, Natalie,
yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is kind of a valuable exercise, in driving forward, what we can learn from various economies within the African environment, but also, through the ASEAN region and through this, the network that, what we ordinarily call BRICS. I don't like these kinds of, putting people in a shell, but still looking at India, China, for example, and how they have brought around development to the fore, whether it's manufacturing, whether it is information technology or what have you. I don't know how many of you have heard of a firm that has produced a new battery encapsulated in diamonds.
No, haven't heard. I haven't heard of that.
What if I told you that all people associated with development of this product are based in Oxford in the United Kingdom, and guess what? They're all Nigerian. Africa does not know its power. I have always said this for the last 25 years. When I see people that I have had the privilege to work with, nobody would, ever dream of saying what I've just said. And this is what's important for us to publicize, to talk about, and allow for, embracing policy. Look, our expectation of government is huge. Let's forget them for the sake of argument. Because I believe regional collaboration allows us to leverage those economies of scale and embrace policies that actually unlock economic potential. Government does not and is not able to, and we as democracies or autocracies or centrally planned economies should not even think about going that way. What we have to think about, I believe, is create policy strategies, realize those small-term visions, and create that sustainable and inclusive growth that would power, African enterprise in the largesse, but West African, as we're talking about now, in a kind of a micro sense, if you like. And to me, that I think is important, because to me, finding potential in the Nigerian state is is about building an economic future for the youth. And it's also about restructuring and creating a competitive, compelling environment that gives us that liberty, gives the people that liberty to get on with it and do that. And because I see a mismatch between, if you like, education, employability, and employment opportunities. And to me, the significance of vocational training is absolutely important. Entrepreneurship programs that are tailored to a country's economic needs is important. And I have examples of success stories, that we've managed to pull together, for a nation state. And I believe that these job opportunities for graduates is absolutely vital. This viral story that went out, this poor Nigerian chap who graduated from an engineering school and was selling water bottles in Lagos, whatever. And my thinking is, why? That is because there is a disconnect between educational institutions providing degree programs that have no basis on or value on the street. And that's the challenge. I'm not saying that I'm showing disrespect to people who sell water on the street. Coca-Cola is an amazing example in Kenya. And so to me, when graduates are not getting jobs that are fulfilling, that is clearly underemployment. And that is the problem. So what do we need to do? A, revise educational curricula, prioritize practical market relevant skills, enhance employability, which is what will automatically happen. And this, I think, is important. How do you connect people to the state? Something that many of you here speakers have talked about. So empowering youth by providing resources to startups, for example, understanding that strengthening partnerships is critical with industry partners, promote internships, promote apprenticeships, whatever the case might be. As I said, half my house was built by 17 and 18-year-olds who had the proper apprentice training with faculty who are supervising these people. And what an excellent job they've done. So to me, that is that institutional building that we talk about in the large S, and we can start that with academia, and we can create these programs, which I have been absolutely privileged to be part of over the last almost 30 years, in working both in industry and academia, allowing us the chance to do that. And again, for me, what's important is for all of us to come together and hash out critical need programs that allow us to show wins at the small level, small step at a time, and it can blossom into something pretty remarkably large that will draw the world's attention. And I'm sure in the present company, we can actually do that and do that quite effectively.
Thank you so much, Professor Regina. Very key points shared there as well. And I'm going to pose my question to Dr. Brian based on your quote of Africa not knowing enough of its power, right? And it's this perspective that I believe also leads us to institutions like the IMF over and over again. It's this perspective that lets us underperform at so many levels. So thank you so much for sharing that. And Dr. Brian, with that being said, how do we worm our way out of the IMF? And how do we ensure that our states are self-dependent, our GDP is increased,
Right.
and jobs are created as well? Yes, your final thoughts on that, please.
All right, beautiful. So thank you so much. First is to understand how IMF actually feed on Africa's underdevelopment. All right, so first of all, when most of the IMF policies, they enforce policies such as currency devaluation, trade liberalization, and this can cripple local industries and foster dependence on foreign goods and loans. And then we have this cycle of debt dependence, right? Many African countries fall into that cycle of borrowing and refinancing debts, high interest payments, and conditionalities tied to loans keep nations economically subservient. And of course, the CIMF will encourage you to focus on extractive industry instead of actually selling developed value-added industries. The IMF-backed programs often encourage African nations to export raw materials, and this prevents reliance on external markets and low value exports. So how can we change that? First is homegrown economic models. This book advocates for strategies rooted in local realities rather than externally imposed frameworks. So by understanding our unique assets, African nations can create policies that prioritize self-sufficiency. Second is economic diversification, where African states must shift from resource-dependent economies to diversified industrialized economies. This, of course, will involve investing in sectors like manufacturing, technology, agriculture, etc., to reduce vulnerabilities to global price shocks. And then, of course, we need to strengthen regional collaboration. That is where platforms like the after African Continental Free Trade Area becomes very important, which can help African nations reduce reliance on global financial bodies by fostering intra-African trade and financial cooperation. Again, talk about debt management and transparency. Borrowing should be focused on productive ventures that stimulate growth. You don't borrow to buy aircraft for the president or borrow to renovate the president's mansion. No, you don't borrow for consumption. Borrowing should be for productive ventures. There should be greater transparency in contracting and spending, and that will reduce the risk of overborrowing and corruption. And then talk about domestic revenue mobilization. Expanding tax bases, reducing illicit financial flows, improving compliance can help us fund our development without relying on external loans. And then look at the local industries and SMEs. By creating favorable conditions, easing the process of doing business, African governments can stimulate job creation, right? Make sure that the necessary infrastructure that will make it easy for SMEs to actually create value and capture value are put in place. That will reduce the need for IMF intervention. So also, what about PPP? So governments can leverage partnerships with private entities to finance infrastructure and social programs, and that will again reduce such dependence. And Prof just talked about human, looking at the curriculum, because you cannot remove human capital development from this. Investments in education, skill building, making sure that people are taught the relevant things they need to succeed in today's economy, right? And so investment in education, skill building, and health will enhance productivity, innovation, and that will make economies more competitive and less reliant on external loans. So how do we address this IMF exploitation? We need to reform the global financial institutions, and there has to be alternative financial systems. We need a unified African voice. And then, of course, we need to shift focus to sustainable financing. And by that, I mean, developed African nations must prioritize long-term investment over short-term gains, ensuring that borrowed funds are used to build capacity and reduce, the need. Those will be ideas you'll find in the book and how we can get off that trap.
Dr. Brian, thank you so much. Now, you pretty much, shared a clear guideline, right, as per how to ensure that we find ourselves not continuing this cycle of always returning to the IMF, homegrown economic models you touched on, and what I personally view as most important, ensuring that our borrowing is always towards productive ventures, right? So thank you so much for sharing that. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guest, I'd want to thank you yet again for spending time with us this Sunday, be it morning, afternoon, evening, and being a part of this and sharing your insights and ensuring that we support this book, much needed book, put out and authored by Dr. Brian Reuben on building stronger states, a guide to economic strategy and development. It's been quite an honor really moderating and guiding this discussion. So thank you all so much, Professor Rajendra, Dr. Sani, thank you as well, and Aneth, and of course, Professor Abuchi Arik Babatunde, Dr. Babatunde. Emmanuel Aliu, I noticed, joined us. Dr. Brian, thank you too for this. And please note that we're going to be issuing a certificate of attendance. That's a CPD certificate of attendance. And Dr. Allison's hand is up, so I'm going to let her have the last word as we draw the curtains on this. Thank you all so much.
Sorry, Natalie. It was just simply to just say that, we are so grateful for people staying on. Some of us have been here for 4 hours. Super, super grateful. But also it was just really to just kind of give you a highlight on the CPD certification that we hadn't planned on it, but I think that it's a way of us giving you back because it's your Sunday. You've given us 4 hours, some 2 hours of your time. We really appreciate that. And I think so does Dr. Brian. And I think for those as well that would like to be involved in the longer discussion around the book, I would absolutely invite you to email the email address that is on the invitation. Let us know of your interest to partake. I think that we will have a wider as well audience from governance. And again, please also reach out to your own networks. We want as much and wider participation as possible. And goodness me, I have learned so much from all of you. The passion is too immense to contain it here. It has to go out. And I also love the idea that there's something beautiful about simplicity. In fact, there's a lot of sophistication in simplicity. If only we can adopt that in Africa, because we don't really need to be so sophisticated in our methodologies to doing things, and just let's work with what we have in front of us. So I hand over to you, Dr. Natalie. I didn't really want to speak. I just really wanted to talk about the CPD, but thank you. And congratulations, Dr. Reuben.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Allison. You keep adding doctor to my name, so possibly I should find myself venturing into, but thank you, Dr. Allison, for that. No worries. And yet again, thank you all so much for being a part of this. It's been an honor.